to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you that we have a live event coming up at Neshoda House Theological Seminary in Wisconsin, and it's on July 24th. You can find information on our website. It's going to be with Gary Schnichter talking about his book, How to Study the Bible's Use of the Bible. It should be a fun event. It starts at 7:15. It's free. There are free drinks and snacks and book giveaways and all that. If you want to come for an optional dinner, that's $20 beforehand. It's at 6:30. You can sign up for that as well on the website. So go to onscript.study/events to sign up for that event. Otherwise, we hope that you enjoy this episode. Welcome back, everyone. Today, our guest is Chris McKinny, who is also a host on our Biblical World podcast. Chris is about to start as Associate Professor of Archaeology at Lipscomb University. He has been the Director of Research at Gesher Media, which aims to bring the stories of the Bible to a wide audience and has a historical, archaeological, and cultural emphasis. He received his PhD from Bar-Ilan University in Israel, dug extensively as a senior staff member at Tel Burna Archaeological project and other sites as well. He's written a ton of stuff. He's the author of My People as Your People, a Textual and Archaeological Analysis of the Reign of Jehoshaphat, and he's co-edited several major books. You can learn a lot more about him via his academia.edu CV. Chris, welcome to OnScript.
Hey, Matt, great to be here. We haven't done this enough. You know, it's we've been working on different sides of the podcasts, but it's wonderful to be together.
Yeah, Chris, I got to know Chris when I dug just for a week at Tel Burna back in, 2011, something like that.
2011, 2012, somewhere in there. You know, the funny thing is I'm working on the report for one of the areas, and I'm going through all the pictures and sending Matt these things over Slack. Oh, look, there's a picture of you guys. It's great memories but I think it's 2012, 2013, somewhere in there.
And would you say I made some of the most significant finds at the site?
Oh, no question.
Yeah.
You know, we're still talking about it.
Yeah. Well, that's the skills I bring. And anyway, Chris, we are talking today about the Ark of the Covenant. And of course, as we talk about that, we have to talk about the tabernacle. And as we talk about that, of course, we have to talk about the Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so I've sort of entitled this podcast, Finding the Ark of the Covenant, a bit clickbaity. But also I want to begin by talking about efforts to do so, to find the Ark, both historically and in contemporary context. I think the sort of elusiveness of the Ark is part of what keeps people interested in this subject. And what kinds of endeavors have been made to find the Ark? And what do you make of some of the sort of popular searches for it?
Yeah, I think it's, first of all, the Ark of the Covenant is a fascinating subject. I say that as someone who never set out to be an Ark hunter, and I say that more, I guess, in the derisive term, but is nevertheless someone who spent a lot of time on the subject. And I guess the first thing I'd say is there tends to be a academic, scholarly pause when the word Ark of the Covenant comes up. Simply because, talking about the Ark of the Covenant, you can get the sense of, well, you're bringing on all of the crazy ideas, all of the outlandish positions on the subject. And one of the things that I've tried to do over the last several years as we've worked on a theatrical film documentary called Legends of the Lost Ark, which is hopefully going to be coming to theaters either later this fall or in 2026. Very confident that it will be, is to try to bridge the gap between these kind of outlandish approaches and real academic research into okay, what exactly happened to it, which we may not be able to answer, but more specifically, what did the ancients think about what could have happened to the ark? So in that sense, it's a kind of reception history of how we approach it. And so that's where ultimately my research and interests lie in, is really in the reception history of the loss of the Ark of the Covenant, in addition to, its creation and all those other elements we could talk about. So that's the kind of the first caveat to this discussion. I also got interested in this. We did an interview. Kyle Keimer, my co-host, and I did an interview. Forgetting the journalist's name, we'll probably put it in there. But he did a book called Underneath Jerusalem, and he makes the statement there that beginning in the 18th and especially the 19th century, people began to be interested in where the Ark of the Covenant might be. And he says, before that, I looked and didn't find any real reason as to where, any people looking for it. So it was kind of said like, with the recovery of Jerusalem, with the recovery of the archaeology with like Charles Warren and others, people began to say, okay, now we found the real temple area of Jesus's temple. We're starting to find some of these archaeological sites like Hatzor, Lachish, and so there's this realia that's coming in. And bigger picture, this is the recovery of Egypt. This is the recovery of Assyria. This is Epic of Gilgamesh, and all these things are happening. And no question, there's this revolution of academic knowledge into the wider world of the Bible. And so, against that backdrop, one might ask, well, what about the granddaddy of them all? What about the Ark of the Covenant? And so that starts to lead to all kinds of different proposals about where it might be in the 19th century, and especially in the early 20th century, when we start to see some of the more harebrained expeditions, especially the endlessly fascinating expedition of Montague Parker, which looked for the Ark of the Covenant, first of all, in the city of David, going through all kinds of tunnels there that Warren had already excavated, and then really throwing caution completely to the wind and secretly excavating in the Dome of the Rock. Who he seems to be the only person to have done that for at least about a week or so, and leading to one of the biggest problems. And there's a whole kind of story to this, but he was essentially excavating in the Dome of the Rock during one of the peak Muslim festivals at the time, where they march out of the city and go to this place east of Jerusalem, associated with Moses, their traditional location of where Moses dies. And it led to this huge scandal. They're driven out of the country, and then World War I starts, and that whole expedition falls apart. So my I guess to answer, and then everything that's happened since then is more or less along the same lines, and even more and more and more degrees of craziness. And I can talk about some of those things. But I do want to go back to the question of, well, why is it only in the 19th century and only in the early 20th century that people started to ask the question, where is the Ark of the Covenant? And I think the answer really lies in the fact that before the 19th century, they knew where it was, and which is a surprise to many people. There's a church in Rome, the Lateran Church in Rome, which is actually the oldest basilica in Rome, and in the high altar there was believed to be the Ark of the Covenant, the rods of Aaron and Moses. In that same church, the pillars of Solomon, and essentially all of the major relics / artifacts that would have come from Jerusalem. And so in the Catholic tradition, And also, I would say to some extent in even the Jewish tradition, because we have Jews visiting Rome and looking at whatever was in this this altar in the Lateran Church, saying, "Oh, there's our ark. It's there," and then they would walk through the streets and they would go to the significantly older Arch of Titus, and they could look up and say, "Well, there's the menorah, and then there's this box-looking thing that looks like the Ark of the Covenant." And they said, "Well, there's the Ark. Clearly Titus. We can still read his name in Latin. When he destroyed Jerusalem, he took the temple treasures. It says it right there in Josephus. The church fathers recorded this information. They brought it, and it ended up in Rome. And of course, let's say from a historical perspective, we know that Titus obviously did destroy the temple and did despoil it and brought the menorah and other aspects on triumph through the Roman Forum. And with his father Vespasian and Titus, as Josephus looks on, as we read at the end of a War of the Jews, he records all this, and it says they build a temple of peace right there in the Roman Forum, which is propaganda for the destruction of the Judeans by the Flavian dynasty. But they never mention the Ark. In fact, that's one of the clearly conspicuous absence from the destruction of Jerusalem. It's never mentioned in the Second Temple. But nevertheless, there starts to be, for sure, around 1200 AD, and maybe even much earlier than that, in the 4th century, hints in Christian literature that there was the belief that the Ark of the Covenant had been in the Second Temple and taken to Rome, and eventually finding its way into the Lateran Church. And so this belief essentially meant that why look for the Ark if you already know where it is? And so about 1715 or so, I forget the presiding pope at the time, he looks at the things and says, "Okay, let's take this one down. Let's keep this one." And the so-called Ark that was there disappears. And so maybe the Ark of the Covenant, that version of the Ark of the Covenant, is actually in the Vatican. I don't know. I don't know what happened to it.
It is.
But that one is no longer in that church. But the bigger, of course, question is, was that the real Ark of the Covenant?
And was this like, was this out on display, or was it like, it's buried under this altar? I mean, is this something that's like prominent where people could touch it, which would seem to be problematic, or what?
No. So the Lateran Church in Rome, which still stands today, and you can still visit. I've never been. I've been to Rome once and was there like 24 hours. I did as much as I could, but didn't make it to this church. Didn't know about it. But there was a great book written on this, about the Lateran Church in Rome. And again, I for some reason can't remember authors today. But she describes and goes through all of the history, which is mostly literary, of people describing it, where it was, what it looked like. And it was at the back of the church. It was a high altar, almost like a kind of a public display of relics. And a version of that altar is still there today, but without the Ark. Now, another part of that church, as I said, claims to have pillars from Solomon's temple. If you look at those pillars, they're clearly ancient, but they're most likely late Roman or early Roman. Clearly not, from the time of the Bible. And that whole emphasis speaks to what the Lateran Church was at the beginning. It was meant to kind of be a replacement of really a supersessionism. Like, Rome is the new temple. This is the new priesthood. We have these artifacts. We have these symbols that are brought in to do that. And actually, I don't know if you want to go this direction or not, but I think that whole thing, which I still would love to dive into a lot more research on, is super fascinating, because one of the things that, the way we talk about the Ark, we often, talk about things where they might be, and the ones that are there are fake. Is something that is 1,000 years old in Rome, or maybe even going back to the 4th century and considered to be the ark. Is that a fake? No, that's an artifact. I mean, that's old. That's very, 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 very significant. And so I think more really the power of the Ark of the Covenant as an idea and as a symbol in its reception history is that it has led to 2 major copies, if you will. I don't use it like the word fake. One of those was in the Lateran Church in Rome. The other one is in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian one there is an ark there. It's just not the Ark of the Covenant, and it has almost as lengthy a reception history and significance. In fact, even more so for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church as the kind of the central symbol of their faith. And in that sense, it aligns closer to the ark's significance was for the ancient Israelites. And so I don't like to talk about these as fakes. I don't think they're the real one that was lost in around or before 586 BC. But I still nevertheless think that the people that brought those into these central sanctuaries, and in the case of Ethiopia, until this very day, that is the center of their faith. That's incredibly significant because it shows, just as the Ark of the Covenant was the center of the faith of the Israelites in Scripture, and the loss of it meant such, kind of an existential threat to their temple cult and existence. So is the case in Rome to a lesser extent, because Christ has fulfilled all this according to their view. But in Ethiopia, that still remains the case.
It's interesting to think about how that might function for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. I just think about the centrality of worship in Orthodox context and the notion of the sanctuary as a kind of tabernacle temple context. And so in many ways, I can see how, especially in the Orthodox context, it would be very significant. But I'm just curious, do you know much about how they relate to it?
I'd say it's an aspect. So I'll make another caveat. The research aspect of this has reached its conclusion in one sense. The film is finished. Legend of the Lost Ark is finished. But in the process, I realized, the study of the Ark of the Covenant represents in some ways the entire breadth of Jewish and Christian Scripture and interaction, both Old Testament, New Testament, intertestamental period, and beyond. And so the task I've set before myself in terms of a writing schedule is to really deal with something I call the Ark Chronicles in a series of books. I've written drafts of the first couple. The last one will really deal with all of not just the ancient legends that I deal with in Legends of the Lost Ark on camera, which we can talk about it at some time, but also these other ones. But in my initial research, what I found is the connection with the Ark is essentially very similar to what we find in the Bible. And I'm talking about with Ethiopia. And the book that they have, of course, is they have the scriptures, but they have another book called Kebra Nagast, The Glory of Kings, which is part of the kind of the propagandistic piece that holds up the Solomonic dynasty as the ruling class, which, by the way, ruled all the way up until the modern era. And so the Ark, and if you read it, there's some really strange, elements that happen. And in fact, some of those end up in Indiana Jones, because in Kebra Nagast, it talks about how the Ark can, you take it to war and it just destroys whole armies and it knocks down mountains, which is something that is said in my favorite scene in all of Indiana Jones when they're talking to the government officials. An army that carries the Ark of the Covenant is invincible. That's why Hitler wants it, to paraphrase. Some of those came from Kebra Nagast, which are obviously,
and that's Kebra Nagast is that Ethiopian.
It's an Ethiopian book. We have it in several copies. It was recovered from Ethiopia. I believe one of the major copies of it was uncovered after the Battle of Magdala, not the one on the Sea of Galilee, but the major capital. This happens in the 19th century. Fascinating story. And this book, it's hard to really to kind of categorize it, but it's an essential piece of the the Ethiopian Orthodox faith and their association with their dynasty, and it includes the legends of the Queen of Sheba going to meet Solomon and having a love child that eventually sent back to Solomon, and he comes back to the Jerusalem temple, and he takes secretly the ark out of the temple when he's making his way back to Ethiopia. And Solomon's like, "Wait, don't do that." And he's like, "Oh, you know what? It's okay. Take it." And so,
which of course you would do.
Yeah, right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Take it. And so that's where we get all this information, which, is super fascinating, even just as a myth building story theme. But then you start to think, well, we have this element also appearing in the book of Acts, with the Ethiopian eunuch, and that story is also important for the Ethiopian Orthodox, where you have someone coming to Jerusalem, reading Isaiah 53, understanding it. So the exact timing, background, association between Ethiopia, its adoption of Jewish practices, eventual adoption of Christian practices, it remains. There's several people that have discussed it and studied it in detail, but it remains kind of a new frontier for research. But one of the big animating factors, to get back to your point, is the Ark of the Covenant and its role as we have it in Kebra Nagast. Now, Kebra Nagast seems to originate from the 13th or 14th century as we have it, but it clearly records earlier traditions, not traditions, in my opinion, that go back to 586 BC, or according to their claim, would be about 950 BC in the days of Solomon. But nevertheless, and I haven't written this anywhere, but really one of the interesting things that comes from Kebra Nagast is they record really original ideas that actually are in the Hebrew Bible that don't show up elsewhere. So my advisor, Aren Maeir, he has an idea based on the story of the ark being lost to the Philistines. And it talks about how they are plagued and they're afflicted in their Ophalim. Which, if you go to the KJV, it's hemorrhoids, it's tumors, it's all these other things. But he suggested, based on the discovery of several clay phallic vessels at Gath of the Philistines, which is one of the places that the ark is taken in 1 Samuel chapter 6, that actually the golden Ophalim, which the Philistines send back with the ark when it goes back to Beit Shemesh, are phallic vessels. And the whole point is that Dagon, this grain god, who is the god of fertility, has been killed. His hands have been, cut off, his head's cut off, and no one can get pregnant. No one can, the earth is not growing. And so they're giving this as an offering. And that precise idea that these Ophalim, as a kind of a phallic vessel, is recorded in Kebra Nagast. So they interpret it. So if you go to it, it seems
that's how they read it.
That's how they read it. So I don't know if that reflects, just intuition or some, or some perspective that carried into their tradition. But it's a real wealth of information that I don't think has been fully tapped. Yeah. So anyway.
Amazing. And with other sort of theories about the ark's whereabouts, who's the guy? Was it Montague? Who is it who dug and then claimed he saw it, but he didn't have a camera or didn't get clear pictures? And talk about that, like excavating under the Temple Mount.
Yeah. So I sort of classify these into different groups. So the first group, what I'd say, are the ancient literary theories about what happened to it. And those, I think, may have some legitimacy. Whether or not they have legitimacy or not, the point is that they're clearly related to, some ideas, and it's all surrounding the prophet Jeremiah, which makes sense. Then you have these traditions that crop up, and the two big ones that I know of are the Ethiopian Orthodox. So it would be in Aksum, Ethiopia, and the other is the Roman one, the Roman Catholic one that would be in Rome. And so to go back then, beginning in the 19th century, you have the renewed search for the Ark with quote unquote archaeology. But really archaeologists don't participate in it at all. They say, oh, we're not going to, this is obviously something that we may not find or won't find. And if we do, it'll be more accidental. In the 19th century, you have two major figures, let's say three major figures, that look for, or that are able to go underneath the Temple Mount. The main one that we know of is Charles Warren and Charles Wilson from the Palestine Exploration Fund. They were able to go underneath the Temple Mount, which is where one of the legends suggests that it is located. But they, of course, don't find it. But they also understand that we can't go everywhere, and there's clearly more of these tunnels that are rumored. And even then, there was little access given to non-Muslims to be able to go into these areas. And so that's why Montague Parker becomes the first person to, okay, let's go look for it underneath the Temple Mount. Now, there's a whole other story there where he has this other person who's giving him the Ezekiel code. You read every third or fourth letter in Hebrew, and that tells you exactly where to look. So he doesn't find it. World War I happens. There is not a whole lot of discussion in the 20s and 30s and 40s about what's going on with the Ark. Interestingly enough, it's precisely at this moment that the Egyptian background of the Ark as the cultural background of the Ark also goes away. It's another kind of topic of discussion, but the interest in the Ark of the Covenant and where it might be, actually in the setting of when Indiana Jones happens, is not really, at least to my knowledge, something that's happening, and mostly because that's political affairs in the wider world. But once Israel is established, and after the 6-Day War, we have a rabbinic community that has access to the area of the Western Wall, and specifically the area of the so-called Western Wall tunnels. And it's there where we have what are clearly illicit excavations that take place in the area of the so-called Warren's Gate. The Temple Mount is standing today mostly, and has, of course, the Dome of the Rock on top of it, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the south. But originally, in the days of Herod the Great, he expands the Temple Mount over most likely an earlier mount from the Hasmoneans, and maybe even an earlier mount from the Iron Age, and adds a series of entryways. This would be Robinson's Arch, Barclay's Gate, Warren's Gate, and all the way up to the area of the Antonia Fortress. So the whole western side, as well as the south and east, have entry points. In the later, let's just say later period, I won't go into the specifics, in the late Islamic Jerusalem, they build a series of domes over that and create these cisterns next to much of the Western Wall, which means now it's underground. And so when Charles Warren, back in the 1860s, tunnels through all of this, I mean, he's literally tunneling through kind of 2,000 years of history, and he uncovers what is clearly a closed entrance into the original Temple Mount. And he explores it in various things, but it was mostly stayed stayed shut. And so if we go again back to the 1970s and 1980s, Rabbi Getz, who is not an archaeologist, is in charge of finding, or he charges the people who are digging, not really digging as archaeologists, but just digging to find things, with finding where it might be. So they plow through the masonry over in front of Warren's Gate. It leads to this entrance, and from that entrance, you can actually get into the area of not only the lower part of the Temple Mount, but can get up to the Temple Mount. Because if you ever walk around the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, you'll often see these kind of green fences around openings. And these are ancient cisterns for the most part, some of which were originally designed as cisterns, some of which were simply enclosed gates that reflect earlier periods in the Temple Mount's history, of which one of those is Warren's Gate. And so as these Hasidic Jewish excavators make their way into the Temple Mount, the Waqf, the Muslim authorities, come down, they meet, there's a clash, doesn't go well. Essentially, the idea is, okay, no more. Let's put a concrete barrier over where this spot is, and we're not going to excavate or approach that anymore. Now, what Getz and several others claim to have found is the real way to find the Ark of the Covenant. Now, if you read them, and the best person who has kind of summarized their positions, which are not consistent at all, is a book called, I think it's called Searching for the Ark of the Covenant by Randall Price, who I'll leave it there. At least summarize a lot of their positions, and you read things like where sort of like trying to kill. What's the lady with all the snakes on her head in Greek mythology? Medusa, yeah. And you have to have a mirror around the corner. Oh, I kind of caught a glimpse of it, and then somewhere else says, "Oh, I never saw it." And we believe that it's in an underground chamber, 100 meters below the Temple Mount, and that's how the water. So I don't.
And wasn't there an account where like they saw it, but they didn't have like a camera or something, or
yeah,
I forget what.
But when pressed with that, they didn't really give any information. So look, I think the fact that they're looking there, in that vicinity, isn't insane in terms of following where the most ancient legends say. I think the most legitimate, if I put all my chips on the table, the most legitimate ancient option, if it wasn't destroyed and it's not in your iPhone and Apple Watch right now, the gold, if it is preserved, it would make sense that it's preserved somewhere in the area of Jerusalem, and it's known to be a place that has many tunnels and caves, and that's exactly what Jewish tradition has said. If you read the Mishnah and the Talmud, which is what the last kind of version of this tradition is, what the later rabbis are actually following, as well as the Second Temple traditions. The best, in my opinion, option is probably the temple. That doesn't mean that it actually is where it is, but at least that's based on
if it survived and isn't melted down.
Yeah, right. But even that, and when we talk about this with scholars, they're like, "Well, I just believe it's destroyed," and I go, "Okay, maybe," but I do have to say, like, if we read the texts, like if you go to Jeremiah, which has two versions of this, Jeremiah 40, 30, 39, 40, I think, and 52. And if you read 2 Kings 25, and if you read the last chapter of Chronicles, and if you read Ezra, or even if you read probably a lot later, the Mene Tekel Parson in the book of Daniel, where they're dealing with the temple treasures, it is conspicuously absent. Like the Ark of the, like you're expecting it. You are expecting it to be there. And there's a great article written by Richard Elliott Friedman, which I find to be quite compelling. I don't think he wrote it even for any publications, just on his academia page, where he says, actually, we don't even know who destroyed the temple. Now, big picture, the Babylonians did. And if you read Babylon, but actually, if you read stuff from like Second Esdras and others, it's actually the Edomites who seem to have been the ones to plunder the temple. That's what Second Esdras says, and that explains, okay, Obadiah is pretty brutal, as is to the nations in Jeremiah. Like maybe actually there is something to be said that the Edomites are to blame, and if they are involved, did they take the ark? Well, actually, one of the legends of the most ancient legends of the ark has the ark in the Edomite territory. So, in any case, the mystery of where the ark could be or what happened to it exists precisely because all of the other religious paraphernalia, the menorah, to some extent, the bronze pillars, Yachin and Boaz, the vessels, all of that stuff is mentioned in its destruction, and the ark isn't. So whether or not it's just kind of a hole in our knowledge and it was really destroyed, we don't really know. But it even if it, let's just say it is destroyed, the fact that it's absent, and then you get to something like Ezra, and at the precise moment, because Ezra follows 1 Kings 8, or the chronicler's version of that, where they have the rebuilding, Tyre and Sidon, cedars from there. Everyone's happy and rejoicing. And in 1 Kings 8, the very moment when the ark is brought from the city of David and it's brought into the Holy of Holies and the cloud descends, everyone is like, okay, we got to back away. There's this like theophany, the cloud from Sinai. And at the exact moment in Ezra, it's where they say they begin to weep because there's no ark. And that's my interpretation. There's not the fulfillment of what we had been waiting for. So I we can talk about this forever, but I think that there's kind of this consistent thread that we can at least trace from a literary side and say the authors want us to remember the ark and what happened to it, or what didn't happen to it, and what that might mean.
So it's kind of an intentional gap in the story that no glory descending, no ark entering into the temple. Instead, there's weeping. We're feeling its absence as readers.
I think it's entirely intentional. The question is, do they have hidden knowledge? And I don't think they do of necessarily what happened to it. But it's precisely that moment that is repeated again in a book that most Protestants and probably many don't read, the book of Second Maccabees. Second Maccabees, fantastic book, starts with 2 letters, written by the Judeans of Jerusalem to the Judeans that live in Egypt, asking them to celebrate Hanukkah. We have this new festival, it's a great one, 8 crazy nights. Let's celebrate. And they're kind of giving them this background in the second letter. And they're saying, you need to celebrate this feast, in honor of Judah the Hammer, which the rest of the book tells the story of Judah the Hammer, where we get, the whole thing. And they're recounting what happened to the holy fire of Jerusalem, the sacred sacrificial fire. And they say that, Jeremiah, right before the temple is destroyed, instructs faithful priests to take some of the fire and hide it in a secret place in Jerusalem. And then they go into exile, and Jeremiah's like, as you're leaving, remember and tell the generations that the sacred fire is there. And so 70 years later, and this is where Second Maccabees makes a mistake, they say Nehemiah. They always thought the Persian period was much shorter than it is. When he comes back and rededicates the temple, he tells the descendants of those priests to go and find that sacred fire. And they go and look, and they knew where it was. And all that's on the ground is something like out of Harry Potter, kind of this black, oozy substance. And they bring it back, and they're like, what are we going to do with this? And he goes, well, let's throw it on the altar and see what happens. So they throw it on the altar, and nothing happens. And then suddenly, boom, light hits it, fire. And it's like, the statement that says, okay, this is just like what happened in Solomon's day. This is just like what happened in the days of Moses and Leviticus, where God's theophany, the fire cloud, descends. But of course, in the story, they keep some of that liquid on the sides, and they actually pour it out on the ground, because later on in 2 Maccabees 10, Judah the hammer, after he has defeated the Seleucids, he goes to those same rocks that have this black liquid on it. He picks it up, he strikes them together, and that's how we can have the preservation of the material substance from the First Temple period to the Second Temple period. So, but the shift in the focus becomes on the sacrificial holy fire, which, I mean, whether you accept that story as historicity or not, you can't help but see its connections back to something like Leviticus 16, where Nadab and Abihu, God's fire descent. So there's clearly a connection. But the story of the ark is not in that main story, because the point is that Judah the hammer has to be able to bring back this fire in some way. But the power of the ark as a story is so strong that they write in the letter. It says in the same document that Jeremiah takes the ark and the incense altar, the ark that has the tablets in it, by the way, if you don't remember, and he brings some people with him. Right before the temple is going to be destroyed, he goes up to the mountain where Moses saw his inheritance and sees a cave dwelling there, and he places the ark in it. And as he's kind of coming out of the cave, the people that are with him, they say, "Oh, okay, don't." They're trying to figure out, okay, we got to make some signposts that we know where to go. Jeremiah says, no, don't mark this location, because the ark will be hidden here until the restoration of all things. And so in Second Temple logic, the ark was preserved. And this is something, by the way, we see in all of the ancient legends, but it would only appear with the restoration of all things, which could be interpreted in a variety of ways. But again, it was kind of like impossible that it could have been lost or destroyed. And just as we see in many ancient legends, ancient stories, the fact that this question wasn't dealt with was wide open for someone to fill in the gaps. It's classic, like the story of the Iliad mentions this guy Aeneas, and he gets attacked by Achilles, and that's kind of the end of his story. Well, get fast forward to the Roman Empire. Aeneas is the hero for Virgil, and they have this whole epic about it. So that's what happened. And so all of the early ark traditions in the Second Temple period are similar to that. They see Jeremiah as the person who is given some type of revelation to go and take it, some place.
It's so interesting how carefully crafted these stories are to create further mystery around the ark itself. It's not just that they say, for instance, and we don't know where it is now, but it's like they're heightening either through a gap in the story or, saying don't mark the way to the ark, or referring just to the vessels and so on, that it's like the stories are designed to make you wonder and to want to look for it or to seek or long for it in some way. And I think too that like that's not totally dissimilar to the very beginnings of the story of the ark in Exodus, where it is covered and hidden and shrouded in a cloud. And, it's like the ark hasn't been seen from its earliest days.
Yep.
Even by the high priest, who, when he goes into the Holy of Holies in Leviticus 16, has to light the incense altar, which is right in front of the Holy of Holies, to create a cloud that surrounds the glory cloud that is over the ark. So when he's flinging blood, it's almost like just pointing in the right direction, but he's not getting a good look at the ark. I mean, I suppose in the book of Samuel is where it becomes visible. But in its origins, in its early days, there's a real sense of hiddenness.
Right. And this is one of those parts that the more you study it and the more okay, we understand the legends on their own terms. We're trying to come to grips with them. But then you're like, okay, well, if we think of something like Leviticus, or we think about, okay, what phase in Israelite history is that reflective of? Because, you go to something like Psalm 24, and I can't say with definitiveness that the ark seems to have also had some type of Akitu festival, that it was brought out on occasion. Now you might say, well, it's never mentioned, but well, why else do we have in Psalm 24 it talking about the King of Glory coming in and gates, lift up your heads? And I at least am, again, I can't say definitively, but it makes perfect sense that whether it's covered or not, that the ark had some part to play in the pageantry of the Jewish New Year, which would be, just before Passover, even though we don't have a lot of record of that. But I completely agree with your point, that when we think about it, it has this level of mystery to it, that it's like a box that it's hard to look straight on it. In terms of history, in terms of story, you're like, oh, what's going on? I talk about in the book that George Lucas, he makes he changes Hitchcock's idea of what a MacGuffin is. Hitchcock would always start a story with some device that you're looking at, and Mission Impossible is a great example. I always got the rabbit's foot or whatever it is, and whereas George Lucas, when he made Raiders of the Lost Ark or whatever movie he wanted to make in the Indiana Jones series, or even in Star Wars, where you have the plans in R2-D2, the story is centered around this device, and it sets the story in motion. But he says the best MacGuffins are those literary devices in which you actually inherently care about the object. And he says the best of all of those was the Ark of the Covenant, because it has this built-in mystery. It has this built-in, like, what the heck is it? It was clearly important. Where is it? And I think that actually one of the enduring reasons why Raiders of the Lost Ark continues to be such a fascinating film, even for those who don't really delve into the lore, but and even more so, I think, launched the character of Indiana Jones, is precisely because Lucas and Spielberg understood and actually deal quite well with the mystery of what the Ark of the Covenant is. They didn't settle for kind of like these cheap tricks about, they explain it, they get you involved, and like, okay, what if? And what if would happen? And so I think whether we're talking about it in pop culture, whether we're talking about it in reception history, or whether we're talking about it at the, kind of at its inception, it's always had that. And I did want to circle back to this, because your point fits in so well with that second legend, or I call this the legend of the tomb, where Second Maccabees tells us that it was hidden in a cave underneath Mount Nebo, essentially Moses' tomb, which is a great place to hide something, sort of like a chamber of secrets from Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Moses' tomb, where nobody can find his body. Great place to put the ark. So that has to be for those listeners, and for people that hold to the Apocrypha, which would include Second Maccabees, as authoritative tradition. That has to be where the ark went to some extent. Like if you're saying, okay, this is not tradition, this is holy scripture, whether it's a deuterocanonical or apocryphal. And so the Catholic tradition points to it being hid in the cave of Moses, and then somehow making its way out of that cave. Because if you remember, I said it's at the restoration of all things. Well, according to Christian tradition, when would that be? It's when Jesus would appear. And so by a leap of logic, therefore the ark made it into the second temple, and therefore it's waiting there for Titus to take it out of the temple and eventually take it to Rome. And so that's the trail of what happens if you are following Catholic tradition all the way through. And so which is fascinating, a fascinating way of putting it together. And I think even if I don't necessarily think that's exactly what happened, I still think it's a fascinating part of this story. But it's built in to the theology, right? That Jesus is in the temple. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. And I would even say to those of you who are wondering, well, is the Ark of the Covenant in the New Testament? Actually, it's not, but it appears kind of in the background in a number of passages. The whole curtain torn in two is clearly directed at what the Ark of the Covenant represented in the Holy of Holies now being available to others. And even that strange passage in Matthew 27 about the saints who are lying asleep may also relate, because it seems to be related to the sons of Korah, which is around the ark. So it's a big deal even in the Christian reception history of what's going on in terms of where the ark might be.
It's interesting too that the Christian reception of that in terms of the ark's function being fulfilled in Christ still left space for a physical ark as well, Ark of the Covenant. Like it didn't get rid of this sort of material like token itself being lost somehow, even though it was in some renderings superseded or taken over, fulfilled, or something like that.
You're speaking my language. I mean, I think that is the conclusion that I feel most strongly about. And I think it may be, I don't know if it's the secret, but it is an element of how and kind of the genius of what the ark is, because it forces us to deal with history, tradition, reception history. It also forces us to deal with theology, right? If the Ark of the Covenant is I always like to tell people, okay, maybe it's lost, but Revelation says the real one that it's based on is in the heavenly tabernacle. So it was always a copy anyway, right? So the copies of the copies of the copies, it's okay. And yet I do think if we think about the physical one, the Sinai one, the one that Moses saw and Bezalel made, I think using an Egyptian background, and was lost in the Jerusalem temple, I do think that there is a strong hope that it will be ultimately returned in some way. And to me, if we think of the ark as the kind of the MacGuffin of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. So if Raiders of the Lost Ark was the Bible, the Bible was not called the Bible; it was called the Lost Ark. You could actually make a case that most of the Hebrew Bible and a good part of the New Testament touches on aspects of the Ark of the Covenant. Even the concept of enthronement, the session of Jesus on the right hand of God, is part of this Ark of the Covenant concept. And in that sense, I find it super fascinating that essentially the greatest literature, fictitious literature of the 20th and early 21st century, at least according to many people voting, is of course Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. And what does he use? He uses a golden object, the rings, to tell his story. And when we first think of the ring, the story of the ring, the Lord of the Rings, we don't think of the ring itself. We think of Frodo and Gandalf and Aragorn and Samwise Gamgee and Sauron, but it's the thing that sort of motivates it. That's the negative side. Really, the Lord of the Rings is kind of like a negative Ark of the Covenant. That is, if Sauron and the forces of darkness could create something with so much power, what would happen? And his answer is, it would always be destroyed because good will always conquer evil. On the flip side, the Lord of the Rings, even though it reached its full fulfillment, is only a small part of the whole story that's in the Silmarillion. And the whole point of the Silmarillion is that a piece of the sacred trees that were what lighted the world in its pre-fallen state was destroyed by even the worst enemy than Sauron, who destroyed these. And the only place that part of those trees' light is still located is in the Silmarils. And it's the whole story of what happens to it. They eventually end up, one is in the sky, which is what Samwise Gamgee looks up at the end when he points up with the file. He's looking up to one of the Silmarils above. One is in the earth, and then one is in the sea. And Tolkien never finished his eschatology for the Legendarium, but he gives us a few paragraphs. And what he says is that in the end, all three Silmarils will be taken from where they were lost, and they will be opened from they are encasing the jewels of the Silmarils, which were done by the elves. And the sacred light of the trees, which was there, and that's clearly a biblical image of Eden, it will be opened and the trees will be remade and it will be rekindled. And so when I think of the story of the Ark, and this doesn't end up in the movie, by the way, that's what I like. I don't know how. I don't know a way. Tolkien couldn't even figure out how that would happen in the context of a story. And actually, I think he was really happy making that a mystery. But there's a vision of God will make all things right in the end, and it will include a tapestry of things that seem to be held in tension or seem to be contradictory. We could talk about amillennial, premillennial, and so on, because this is really a part of that. But he will do it. And so that's where I end up with. How exactly it happens, I guess I'm just excited to find out. But I think, at least on the table, is the possibility of some physical return. I don't think I will be the one to find it. I'm good with that. I don't really want the responsibility of doing that. That's not why I'm doing this anyway. But I think just the process of seeing it, of seeing how this story is essentially a human story. It's a divine story, but it's also kind of like how all these stories all work, right? Whether it's the Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion or all of them have this kind of device. And I'll end at least this thought with something that I wanted to end the film with. I don't think we ended up with a dialogue because we didn't quite build this thread through. But one of my favorite lines in any book comes from the last chapter, the last page even of the last battle in the Chronicles of Narnia, and where Mr. Tumnus is talking to Lucy, and they're seeing as they've come into the inner Narnia, and then they're looking at another inner Narnia, and there's this bridge that takes them to the true England, and Lucy's asking about what's going on, and he says, everything that is good, everything that is worth meaning, none of that is lost. Nothing good is lost, is essentially what he said. And I think if we think of the story of the Ark, kind of this animating feature of God's presence among his people, it has these layers that all take us to where we are now. We would never be we would never be in the new age that's dawned in the eschaton of the first century and until today without all that preceded it. And I think the fact that we have it in the book of Revelation, in Revelation chapter 16, and that we have it alluded to in the Gospels, I would even say that in John 21, when Mary Magdalene meets, she comes back into the tomb, and that's a very Ezekiel-driven book in the Gospel of John. It says that there's an angel at the foot and in the head of the tomb. There's a couple people who have said this, but it's super interesting that Mary's vision before she turns and sees the gardener is, I think, a vision of the chariot, a vision of like Ezekiel 1 and Ezekiel 8-11, and it's Mary Magdalene, the first apostle, who gets this, and it's a relevant piece throughout the story. Only if we look at it not as some kind of like magic box, but as God's presence. And one more last thought. I think in that sense, what is the temple, right? What is the temple in the Second Temple period? It's where God's presence is, but is it? Is it there? Is it somehow lost? Because there's never that, return. Acts 2 tells us it goes into people. And yet God's presence is still somehow there. And I think that's the same thing with the ark. It exists as a metaphor for people being built up as a spiritual house, as Peter says. We are living, breathing arks of the covenant in Christian theology. But that doesn't supersede the need to have a temple rebuilt or to have the ark. Like, that doesn't mean that it can't happen. So
Yeah.
anyway, that's
we often have a very sharp dichotomy where if there is a sort of metaphorical rendering of the church as temple, therefore physical temple no longer has any purpose, any function. And so whereas in, even in the first century, there are suggestions that synagogues were not that they were thought to be little temples, but they were in some ways like mimicking aspects of temple worship in local communities. But I don't think any of them thought, therefore, the temple in Jerusalem is no longer needed, right?
absolutely.
And so they're thinking about their local synagogue life as a sort of either proxy or analogy, or having sort of analogous functions and so on, but still valuing the temple in Jerusalem. So it really isn't an either or. I want to do a speed round just to kind of break the pace up a little bit here.
Can I say one thing just about that, and then we can do a speed round? It's exactly what Moti Aviam, the excavator of El Araj, Bethsaida, that case has been made about the famous Magdala stone. The Magdala stone that was found in the synagogue. If you look at that stone, it's got menorah, it's got sheaves associated with probably the festival of Shavuot. At the back, you look kind of through these arches, and you have these two wheels. He has suggested that actually what you're seeing on that is like a glimpse of the Merkabah, the chariot of the cherubim in Ezekiel 1. And I'm like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know if you're right, but I really like that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I find the Magdala stone interesting and hard to interpret, but also very suggestive. And it does seem to have a lot of, it certainly has temple imagery on it, whether how far and extensive it is. But, like people have suggested, like brought their offerings that they were going to bring to the temple there and sort of exchanged it for money that then was brought to Jerusalem. And different theories about that, but yeah, Richard Bauckham wrote about that as well, a big book on it. All right, what's one idea in biblical archaeology that you think needs to die?
I think one idea in
biblical
archaeology, needs to die is the idea that biblical archaeology is only associated with the Hebrew Bible. It's associated with the New Testament also. Very strongly, very powerfully.
What's the most significant book in archaeology of ancient Israel in the last 50 years?
The most significant book? I'd still say Sacred Bridge by Steve Notley, by Anson Rainey and Steve Notley. It's at least the most significant to me.
Yeah. Well, I think you've already answered your favorite novel, Lord of the Rings. Is that fair?
I'd say two. If I have to break it down, Two Towers and The Magician's Nephew.
Okay. And what on the Lord of the Rings, what do you think is the most underappreciated feature of that trilogy?
The most underappreciated aspect of the trilogy is the depth of what's happening in the story. Like you can scratch anywhere, and if you read modern fantasy literature, that's the depth, but there's
layers.
There's more than you want to know beneath.
Did you like the Peter Jackson movies?
I really liked the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings. I thought The Hobbit was not quite hot garbage, but pretty much a poor adaptation, and he would even admit that.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't ask me about the Rings of Power.
Oh yeah, is that the Netflix one?
Amazon. It's
the Amazon one. Yeah. I watched several of those, and we didn't even end up watching them all. So
yeah. It's I hope someone can do it justice, because it needs to be done.
Funniest moment on an archaeological dig?
Funniest moment. Sort of funny, sort of fun. One of the things I always try to do at Burna is to go up. We climb up the Tel. I get to drive the truck.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always have queued up Raiders March, and I save it from the theme song of Indiana Jones. I save it to when there's like, a 19, 20-year-old kid in the back of the truck climbing up, and I just play it. And I'll just look out the mirror, and the beamingness of their face, just smiling, is always a wonderful sight. And I'm beaming as well.
Yeah. Now, what's a site that you have not dug at that you would love to dig at or have, been part of the excavation?
There's too many, but if I were to take one, I would love to explore the location of the Molech cult, the Tophet in Jerusalem, to see what was there archaeologically. I think it's that little area to the south of Jerusalem. Lots of fascinating things. I'd love to dig there. Will never happen, but I'd love to dig there.
Speed round took a dark turn there. All right. What's your signature dance move?
It's to be goofy. Whatever strikes me, because I can't dance at all. Didn't grow up dancing, so whatever I can to make somebody laugh, that's it.
Were you born in Texas?
Yep, born and raised.
Okay,
South Texas.
So all right. So on Texas, they're gonna. I think there's a proposal, or I don't know if it's law yet, to put up the 10 Commandments. So, in public places, schools, something like that. Let's skip the whole debate about whether that should happen. Here's the question: should they put up the Jewish 10 Commandments or the Protestant Catholic ones?
That's a great question.
Which order?
I actually think, and I don't normally do this, but I haven't looked at it closely, but I think the Protestant one just makes more sense in terms of the order. So I would have to say the Protestant one, and because of it's mostly being a Protestant country, I'd say the Protestant one.
Okay. So your next site that you're going to dig at.
So sort of remains to be seen. I was supposed to be in the field this summer at a new project called Tel Eter or Kirbet Eter, which is a site mentioned a couple times in the Bible, Joshua 15:42. We have it said Libnah, which is Tel Burna, Eter, Ashan. We're excited about going there for one season, but of course, the war with Iran. So the goal, and assuming we can, is Ashdod. That's the new project for the Tel Burna Archaeological team, or the team that's based with Itzik Shai and Steve Ortiz from Lipscomb University, and for Ariel University. Myself, I'm kind of in a interesting spot. We'll see what happens as I'm starting at Lipscomb. We'll see what happens, but probably something more Second Temple in the near future, but a lot of unknown at this point.
Did you know nowadays the name Lance is uncommon? But in medieval times, people were named Lance a lot.
Nice. I wonder why that is.
Yeah. So this man with authority walked into a bar and he orders everyone around. Do you want a brief explanation of what an acorn is?
I do.
In a nutshell, it's an oak tree.
Very nice. Very nice.
All right, last one. Most significant archaeological find in the last 25 years in this sort of world of biblical archaeology.
Most significant. I'd say, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to say two that have the potential to really change the field. And both of them are not necessarily archaeological discoveries of like an artifact, but discoveries of a phenomena that could really change things. One is the unraveling through digital means of the Herculaneum scrolls, the archive that was there. I mean, we know where Plato is buried. Who knows what's there in that? I mean, maybe there's some missing whole manuscripts of the missing epics. Maybe there's stuff that deals directly with the New Testament. I mean, it's destroyed in 79 AD CE. The other one I'd say that at least has the possibility of transforming the field is the use of paleomagnetism on archaeological sites for dating. That is no longer having to rely completely on pottery or C14, but essentially being able to look at a mud brick or something that's burned and be able to track what the electromagnetic field was like at any given period of time. Yoav Vaknin of Hebrew University, graduate there, has really pioneered that research.
Amazing. And has that led to any, I don't know, redating?
It's led to quite a lot of potential redating. He's been busy with other things. I'll just leave it at that. In the last couple of years, but several major publications have come out, and it's led to the redating of whole strata associated with destruction layers of the key sites in the Iron Age debate of places like Rehov, Megiddo, Beit Shan. It may redate, as the initial indicators are, of even things like the lamellic seal impressions being much older. But the key, why it's so important is it could be done for any archaeological destruction. I mean, Jerusalem is 4,000 years old, 40 different if you find any destruction layer and can date it in this way, it can be then the way that we understand so much more. So even though it's only been mostly Iron Age at this point, it has the great potential of making destruction layers that we don't know about from historical records even more historically important, as well as ones that we haven't studied yet. So it's an incredibly important discovery.
So I want to just transition to talk about the Egyptian context of the Ark, because that's a big part of what you've been looking at the tabernacle. So maybe start by just talking about why understanding Egyptian iconography and archaeology, think of like P. Ramses, is that how you say it? P. Ramses?
Yeah.
Is significant for thinking about the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah, maybe I'll just start with where I kind of got super excited about this. I remember reading an article, I think it was in Mosaic magazine, by Josh Berman at Bar Ilan University, and it still makes the rounds here and there. Did the Exodus happen? And his big proof that it did happen, or at least was plausible from a historical perspective, was to compare kind of two main elements of the book of Exodus to New Kingdom Egyptian background. One element was literary, to compare, for instance, the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15 to the hymn the hymn of Kadesh, and then there's a couple of different versions of that. One is longer, one shorter, to what we see in the Song of the Sea. Fascinating literary comparisons down to I made them go into the bottom of the sea like crocodiles, the Hittites, and Yahweh says they fell into the bottom of the sea like a rock. I have a strong outstretched right arm. There's a lot of interesting parallels there, and the fact that this song was the greatest hits from the days of Ramses for a while, and all the Ramessides were named after him. There's 11 different Ramesside pharaohs because Ramses was the greatest pharaoh ever. So it's we see it on the temple walls of places like Karnak and others, but this was a big part of the kind of the cultural fabric. And so for the writer of the book of Exodus to bring in that kind of language that subverts the story, I think is really powerful. And the point of contact that is really clear, in which that definitely happens, is in the book of Isaiah chapters 36, 37, 38, which is also where we get in 2 Kings, where Sean Zeligaster, also at Bar Ilan, has pointed to the Assyrian royal propaganda of Sennacherib, and how Isaiah is using that as a way of saying, yeah, you're not who you think you are. And it's the exact language. So it only exists, at least according to Sean Zeligaster, in this tight window associated with Sennacherib. And it's precisely this that we see in the book of Isaiah. So that same logic, I'm saying that because that's pretty well established historically. The Exodus, not so much. And so it's applying the same logic to the language. But on the more archaeological side, the really interesting thing is if we compare the war tents of Ramses II. Now, we don't have the actual war tent. We have depictions of them on several major of his temples. So wherever Ramses built, he made people know that he defeated the Hittites, even though he probably didn't quite defeat them entirely, and gave the song, gave her different depictions. And he loved to depict this one moment in which he fought the Hittites by himself, which is probably a really major tactical error to go to the forefront. Somehow survived, and they often include like his pet lion going with him.
Well, he's gigantic too. He's like 20 feet tall in those images.
Yeah, he's huge. Exactly. But what they often show is in the center of this relief, they have a wide courtyard that's surrounded by shields, and it's surrounded by the military apparatus of the Egyptians. And in the center of that courtyard, you have a two-part tent. And at the best one, the one that I had the privilege of going to for the first time this last October at Abu Simbel, which is actually carved directly out of the mountain, which is why it's so well preserved. Even the ceilings are preserved. You have a two-part site throne tent, and with worshipers. At the very back, you actually have the cartouche, the name ring of Ramses II, with two Horus falcons facing the cartouche. And what that's representing is the place of where the pharaoh on his throne was reigning. And then you start to look at everywhere in New Kingdom iconography, wherever Pharaoh's presence goes, whether it's a throne or a mobile throne, it often has these symbols of winged figures. And so the point was actually made earlier. I mean, the point was made by Michael Homan back in 2002 that the war tent of Ramses II at Abu Simbel, at the Ramesseum, at Luxor Temple, it seems to match very closely with the tabernacle. And I still think that once you see it, it's pretty obvious that it does.
Yeah. So you have the two-part temple, even in military context, there's a lot of military associations with the tabernacle, especially as you look at the book of Numbers. The two winged creatures on either side. And I also think of King Tut's throne, because that is with a winged creature on this gold throne on either side. He had the sort of flanked winged creatures on his throne.
Right. It's the winged snake on both sides. But yeah, same thing.
Yeah,
I completely agree. I think that when we look at New Kingdom Egyptian iconography, it closely parallels what we see in the description of the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant, as it is in the book of Exodus, as it is in Numbers, where we have some of the details. There may be later stuff that's brought in there. I have no doubt that there is. But to your point, I forget, I think it's number 16, but there's the short song of the Ark, right? Where it says, "Rise, O Yahweh, and defeat your enemies. Thousands and thousands of angels, these warriors are in your train." I mean, so it's very similar to just as Yahweh is in the center of this tabernacle. He defeats Pharaoh. He defeats the Amalekites. He defeats various people. So was Pharaoh. And one of the things actually I deal with, or want to deal with, I haven't dealt with completely in the book, is that there's kind of these predecessors to that. And one of the key predecessors to the ark in the tabernacle is actually the staff of Moses. So the staff of Moses, which he drops at the burning bush. And I love how Spielberg puts it, "With this staff, you will do my wonders." And that's, of course, the thing that the plagues are brought on by. When the priests or the Egyptian priests are there, they say the finger of God is among. I actually think it's talking about the staff. If God can do this with just this little finger, how much more so if he can't? And so that's the thing that parts the Red Sea. That's the thing that he's holding up when the Amalekites are defeated, and then that gets brought in either as the staff of Aaron or not exactly sure, into the tabernacle. And so that's one more example of how there's like these layers of how God is using physical objects, physical imagery, metaphorical aspects like the cherubim, and bringing it in. So that's another aspect to it that not a lot has been written on.
Yeah, now, of course, the sort of idea that there's interaction with Ramesside iconography and ideas depends in part, not entirely, but on a roughly contemporaneous dating for at least the events of the Exodus, apart from when they were finally written down. So maybe talk about the site of P. Ramses and why that's important for understanding that as a plausible context.
Sure. Let me spend 30 seconds trying to show big picture history research why this matters. With the recovery of ancient Egypt in the early 19th century, people immediately looked at bark shrines that have winged figures on them, and they said, these are Egyptian versions of the Ark of the Covenant. All the way for 100 years till the 1920s. Flinders Petrie, Ma'at figures on these Ark shrines. This is grace and truth, like in John 1:18, that goes back to Hesed ve'emet in Exodus. Everyone was saying this. This was like, a major tenet of archaeological background. Sometime in the 1930s, 1940s, it's lost. And they start saying the Ark, the tabernacle, these go back to some unique desert nomadic tabernacle that has its origins in the Arabian Peninsula, comparing it to the Kaaba and Mecca, and then things go on, and we have Michael Homan's the late Michael Homan's book on the tabernacle. 2015, and by the way, tomorrow I'm going to the 10-year anniversary of this Exodus conference. 2015, there's an article that says, I discovered that it's the Egyptian background. Nothing against the people that did this, but this is something that was largely forgotten. But all that to say, with the renewed excavations of a variety of places in ancient Egypt, but especially P. Ramses by Manfred B. Tech at Avaris and others at P. Ramses, which is all part of a massive metropolis in Lower Egypt, it's become more and more clear, at least in my opinion, that there is a strong historical background to the memory that's preserved in the early Exodus tradition. So, the connections are geographical, the fact that you have P. Ramses especially, and that P. Ramses at the time was by far and away the biggest city to have existed that we know of. Huge. It's not surpassed until Babylon and Rome. It's a massive city, and it only exists for about a century or so before.
Yeah, you said it was bigger than Nineveh, bigger than
Nineveh, bigger. It's not. It's a major thing, and this also plays a role in like the early date versus the late date. Those who call for an early, like P. Ramses wasn't P. Ramses in the 15th century. It's only P. Ramses in the 13th and in the 12th century. And one of the fascinating things, and something I really want to explore further, is, well, take a step back. All of our best tabernacle, ark, Egyptian parallels come from Upper Egypt. Why? Less rain, better preservation, more temples. So the funerary temples in the valley or near the Valley of the Kings, and the temples of Amun and Karnak and Luxor Temple and so on. Those are preserved to a great height, have beautiful reliefs on them of things like the Battle of Kadesh, depict the bark shrines. Of course, we have an actual ark, the Anubis shrine, which at least is functionally not the same, but it's of the same design, shape, size as the Ark of the Covenant. But where all the action is happening in the book of Exodus is in the Eastern Delta, right? It's in the area of P. Ramses. It's a Delta story. And so one of the things that I'm super fascinated by is the fact that, well, if you think of Seti the first, who's the father of Ramses the second, maybe the pharaoh of the oppression, although I wouldn't say that strongly either way. Seti is named after Seth. And who is Seth associated with? None other than Baal, the Canaanite deity, who, pretty big bad guy in the Hebrew Bible. And so one of the main temples in P. Ramses, going back all the way to the age of the Hyksos, who were Semitic peoples who worshipped the storm god Baal, is a temple to Seth Baal inside of P. Ramses. And so if you just think about, Israelites living in the great metropolis of P. Ramses for, a generation or so, or living in the vicinity, and there's a temple which is devoted to a Semitic deity who's been sort of Egyptianized. And the way they worship him is they carry around a bark shrine with curtains and winged Ma'at figures with the symbol of Baal, Seth, on the throne. It's absolutely fascinating. And of course, the same applies to Amun-Ra. The same applies to Pharaoh. It applies to all the gods. They're all worshipped in this way. But that aspect really brings it more home to me, because if we think about even the Red Sea crossing, whether or not, and I know there's a long debate about what is creation and how does it relate to the chaos monsters and so on. At least in my opinion, there's no question that the smiting of the sea, the parting of the sea at the place that is associated with a Baal name, is one of the places in the itinerary where they go to the sea, is associated not only with quote unquote an Egyptian exodus, but where they are, Egypt is not like inherently all Egyptian. They're Egyptian, but they've been so Semiticized throughout that period. And the chief, titular deity of the Ramesside kingdom is Seth, who is associated with Baal. So it's like, there's a great line in Game of Thrones. We're going after the first enemy and the last, death. And so Baal is like this enemy that shows up at the beginning of the story, throughout the story, and even when when Jesus is near Caesarea Philippi, which is a place where Baal was worshipped, he talks about that he's fallen down. What's his name? Baalzebul, right? Baalzebul has, so it's like we have this one guy we can point to, and his name necessarily isn't Satan, it's Baal and Baalzebul, and Satan is sort of associated with it. So that aspect is super, super fascinating. And think about those wise men and magicians that are there. I mean, which temples are they associated with? They could be associated with Baal. They could be associated with these other gods. So it just adds so much, I think, to the realia of the story. And what I'm not saying is that it has to, fit into these particular buckets of historicity and archaeology, but I just think that there's so much there for a New Kingdom Egyptian background to many of the details that we have in the Exodus story, that really the onus is not on someone who thinks that. The onus is on someone who says, no, the ark, the tabernacle, all of these elements have a different cultural background that is associated with the late Iron Age, with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, or even the Persian period. Because if you try to do that, it doesn't go so well. You can't point to any of these things where there is this level of compatibility.
And I think it's a good example of how you can recognize on the one hand that the Bible has been edited, redacted, transmitted through the ages, reached its final form, who knows when, but it's preserving the memory of a context that it fits within very well, and can be plausibly situated within that probably best accounts for a lot of the features we see in the Bible, and some of it at a period in history when it could only be from that period. So I think, the work that you and others are doing on understanding the Ark in that historical context is so fascinating. So I look forward to seeing how that research continues to develop.
Yeah, one of the things, if I could just add to that I think is just kind of like if you were just to point to one thing, is cherubim, right? In fact, this was the very first article of the Biblical Archaeologist, written by William Foxwell Albright. What are cherubim? And it has the Sistine Chapel with the fat baby cherubs, and it has the Hiram sarcophagus where he has the Sphinx cherub throne. And cherubim, as described in the Bible, as seen throughout the ancient Near East, match, whether we're talking about the Mesopotamia, Phoenicia, Egypt. They're not always called, but there are these fantastic creatures, and they knew where to find them. Maybe they didn't see them, but they always depicted them in their temples. They depicted them on the ark. They depicted them on their thrones as creatures of great significance. And that knowledge of what those are and where they are, when you get to the Second Temple period, is largely lost. I always like to point to what Josephus says in Antiquities. He describes the building of Solomon's temple. He describes the ark. He describes kind of reading through, paraphrasing the Hebrew Bible. And then when he gets to the two cherubim that are in Solomon's temple, these massive things that had wings that stretched out with their hands, touch the walls, he says, and we have these things called cherubs, but no one knows what they look like and what they are. And you're thinking, Jesus didn't know what a cherubim looked like. Josephus didn't. He was a priest, right? And in fact, no images of these things in the Jerusalem temple. And yet, even though they've lost like the cultural milieu, and that's what, like, it's not just for us. That's what my point is. We're receiving this and we're understanding it, but the Bible has been received, and it's shaped and formed the way people have tried to live according to its principles, even within the story and history of the Bible.
Things are being forgotten.
Yeah, they're being forgotten. It's a long, stinking story. And that's why the Ark is this like touchstone for so many of this stuff.
Right. Well, Chris, I've really enjoyed talking about this. There's so much more we could get into. So hopefully this is just the first of many conversations about the Ark, the tabernacle, cherubim, seraphim, who knows? We can cover it all. But also I should mention in the Biblical World podcast, you and others have talked at length about things like the date of the Exodus, the Egyptian context of the Bible. There's a lot on related themes over there. So I would point our listeners to the Biblical World podcast for more. But it's been great having you, Chris. Thanks so much for your time, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks, Matt.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.